Hi there, my name is Kelly Blidook. I'm an associate professor of political science at Memorial University, and I just want to give a quick explanation of some issues surrounding the 2021 Newfoundland and Labrador election and some potential considerations regarding it. As many of you will know, the Newfoundland and Labrador election has been postponed due to COVID. There's a high degree of uncertainty and confusion around it. Some have even questioned its legitimacy, and I want to discuss that. This presentation is meant to facilitate discussion, so please share it, discuss it, feel free to contact me and discuss it with me. I can't promise responses to everyone, but I am interested in people's thoughts, and of course you can email me or you can find me on Twitter. I'll also provide a few very accessible readings right at the end of this, but I want to clarify, this is not a research paper, it's an informed opinion. And it incorporates material that I research, material that I lecture on, and I want to take that material and apply it to the current case. So this video is meant to aid those who don't know a lot about democratic government and how it works in Newfoundland and Labrador. I'm going to start by talking about the basic structure of democratic government. From there, I'm going to talk about citizens' role in government, and then how we arrive at the issue of uncertainty with the current election, and what might be done about it. So first of all, we usually think about three branches of government, and those are the legislature, which makes and amends laws, the executive, which proposes and executes law, and the judiciary, which interprets law. And I want to briefly explain each of these because that'll be important in terms of understanding where we go from here. So first of all, there's the legislature. This is an elected body. The legislature determines who the government, essentially the premier, are via confidence. And essentially what this means is that of the 40 seats that are in our legislature, in our House of Assembly, which we are electing people to through this election, so long as more than half of them support a given party leader, that person becomes premier and that person names a cabinet. But the legislature is currently dissolved. And that's what happens when we have an election. There are currently no members sitting in seats in the House of Assembly currently. We have a system that we call responsible government, and the way that that works is that the government of the day, or the premier and the cabinet, the executive, which I'll get onto in a second, are responsible to the House, which is elected. So the elected House determines who gets to be in charge. Next we have the executive. So first of all, we can think of the head of state, which is the Queen. But more importantly, I think for our purposes, really the lieutenant governor, who is the representative of the head of state. And this person is in a position to do a few important things. Sometimes people think of the lieutenant governor as being unimportant. But in terms of its relationship, especially to the legislature, I think it's important to know that the lieutenant governor can prorogue the legislature. In other words, make it take a break. The lieutenant governor can also identify the head of government, who becomes the premier. They will do that based on the confidence of the House, as I already mentioned. And finally, they can dissolve the legislature. And dissolving the legislature is what occurred that put us into the election that we're currently in. Calling an election is a pretty important thing that the lieutenant governor does. It's done on the advice of the head of government, who is the premier. So the next part of the executive, of course, is the premier and the cabinet. They are responsible to the legislature, as I've already discussed. But when the legislature is dissolved, they take on a caretaker role. And what this means is that while the premier is still the premier, the health minister is still the health minister, they are not members of the House of Assembly, of course, because nobody holds seats in it, but they still hold their position in government. But as a caretaker role, essentially they try to minimize as much as possible anything that they do. They should not be making announcements, they should not be doing anything of significance, besides really just the government carrying on as it normally would. It's kind of what I would describe as the government being on cruise control on a straight track. And that's the way that it should remain so long as the legislature is dissolved. And finally, we have the bureaucracy. So the bureaucracy falls under the cabinet. And this is basically, it's relevant at this point simply because it also is aiding in administering the vote. So we have a chief electoral officer. That chief electoral officer is part of the bureaucracy. And finally, I want to talk briefly about the judiciary. Of course, this is the courts. The courts interpret the law and the Constitution, and that's important here because, of course, the voting processes we're following are part of the Elections Act in Newfoundland and Labrador. And it's also important because the Constitution determines our right to vote as citizens. It's also important to note that the judiciary is independent of the legislature and the executive. While the legislature determines who the executive is, those two things are necessarily linked. The judiciary is not linked to those two bodies. It basically determines whether or not what government is doing, whether or not it's doing it properly. And so it's probably going to come into play a fair bit, because of the nature of the election that we're currently in. Now, I said I wanted to connect citizens to all of this. Well, citizens matter in all of this because we're the ones who determine via elections who the legislature is. So all of those seats in the legislature that are currently empty, well, we are the ones who get to fill them. We can run for those seats, but more importantly, during an election, we get to vote for the people who can now go and take those seats. Section 3 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms determines that we have a right to do this, and that's an important right, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail. And of course, we do this according to the Elections Act in Newfoundland and Labrador. So I want to be clear that in the process of doing this, citizens are choosing the legislature, and the legislature in turn will determine who the premier and cabinet are. And so, that cabinet can do a lot of stuff. And normally, if the legislature is there, it can do the normal stuff we expect. It can react to things, it can make new policies, it can change things a fair bit. Some people have referred to the Prime Minister with a majority government in Canada as being an elected dictator. And this concept would also apply to premiers as well. Some people refer to provincial governments really as being premiers' governments. And while I disagree with the term elected dictator, I would just agree that these people can do a lot of stuff. But if the legislature is dissolved, they cannot do much at all. And so it's really citizens who empower all of government through the fact that we elect a legislature. And so that's why it's extremely important that when we cast our votes, the results of that election are certain. So this brings us to question number 1, and that is, are the results of the vote likely to be uncertain? Well, there's a few things that have occurred here that not only I have identified, a number of other people who are experts have also identified this. These include the change to the polling date. It's not clear that this was legal. And we don't actually yet know, as I'm recording this, when the polling date actually is. There's been the suspension of in-person voting. Again, not clear that this is permitted in the legislation in Newfoundland and Labrador. It's also a question as to whether or not this might be a violation of a charter right to not have this. And I would say that more recently, some of the discussion that we've seen around the registration to receive the mail-in ballot also suggests that this may have been incomplete. And that's not to relitigate any of the statements that have been made, but just to recognize that there are some things that will definitely end up going before courts. And when that happens, again, we'll be questioning these both in terms of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the right to vote that all Canadian citizens have, and we'll also be questioning them in terms of whether they followed the legislation in Newfoundland and Labrador. Further, it could also be that there is uncertainty that is cast upon the entire election, the whole thing, or it's possible there will be uncertainty based on district results. So there's a possibility that of 40 districts, some of those districts will be determined to have had legitimate elections and some will not. So will these irregularities in our election be such that the courts will order a new election? I want to start out by saying we don't know, and that's why I'm using the term uncertain. There's a primary question that will be asked, and that's whether the election was run in a manner that it fit with the laws and with the Constitution. From past cases, we can say that we sort of know that the judiciary doesn't like overturning elections. It doesn't like to call elections illegitimate. But there's a lot more going on in this election than what we can entirely derive from that precedent. This situation in Newfoundland and Labrador is actually somewhat unprecedented. It's also worth noting that a charter violation can be acceptable if it's deemed to be reasonable to the circumstances as per Section 1 of the Charter. So the question will also be whether each potential issue here could be considered a reasonable limitation of the charter right to vote. So there's some reasons that we might think that there won't be an overturning, but there are a number of reasons still to think that that could occur. There's also sort of a constitutional question here to get a little bit more specific about this, and this to kind of get at some of the narrative that has surrounded whether or not people should have done things differently, whether people should have registered sooner, whether people should have used the opportunities to vote prior to the ones that were afforded them. I think that we need to put that all to rest. The question on the Constitution here will not be, did citizens try hard enough to vote? But rather the question will be, did government enable citizens to vote? I think it's worth highlighting very clearly here from the Department of Justice federally that a failure on the part of governments to take positive action, to put in place appropriate mechanisms to enable citizens to exercise their right to vote, can also restrict Section 3, which is the charter right to vote. What this means is government is required to deliver in as equal a manner as possible the right to vote to all citizens. Now, I noted before that the courts don't like overturning elections, but another thing that we can look at is that the courts have also had a very strong precedent towards saying that everyone has to be able to vote. There used to be some restrictions to which citizens can vote, and those have been struck down. The only restriction that remains is that of age. So the courts like this right to be expanded and enjoyed by as many citizens as possible. And that probably matters a little bit here. If the vote was suppressed in any manner, or there are certain types of voters that were less likely to be able to vote than others, that will probably be important. Now keep in mind, citizens determine the legislature, which in turn determines who the head of government will be. And so I think the next question we want to ask, if we're asking about the election itself and whether or not voting by citizens was done properly, the next question, of course, will be, are the seats held by MHAs legitimately held? I think it's important to note that following an election, legally, MHAs should sit in those seats. They can sit in those seats. And that could change, though, based on the courts, based on decisions about the irregularities in this election. Politically, though, we might suggest that it's not clear, even with election results, that there needs to be a consideration of the fact that these results might be overturned. Further, in terms of the legislature determining who the executive is, the next question is, can the Premier and Cabinet exercise authority as though it holds confidence of the legislature? In other words, can we move from being a caretaker back to being, Premier's government, or even what some people might call an elected dictatorship? Again, legally, following the election, this would be permitted until such a time as a court makes a decision otherwise. That might take a while to determine legally. Again, though, I would say that politically, it would probably be a significant mistake to exercise this authority while the results of the election are in limbo. And so we need to think a little bit about the avenues here. So if we're talking about this election as being uncertain, if we can use the term uncertain to describe this election, what are the avenues beyond the election? Well, I think the first avenue we could then say is that you could still treat the election as certain. It would be legal for a government to show up, for a legislature to sit, and for them to begin doing things. And so we could have a situation with the Premier and Cabinet that governs as usual with the confidence of the legislature. I think there are risks involved with this, and the most important risk, and I don't want to understate the importance of this risk, is that the courts could determine this should not have happened. It could determine that the election was illegitimate, and there's a number of reasons to think that this might happen. There are also a number of other things that come along with this. One would be that there's a high likelihood of an uncertain or uncooperative legislature. What I'm getting at here is that if the results remain uncertain, if court cases are ongoing, if things are in limbo, then you may have one party that feels it can govern and decides to do so, but you may have other parties that choose not to cooperate with that. It's quite possible that if we do go into a circumstance like I'm describing here, we could see lawful disruption by political parties that is beyond anything that we've seen in modern times. It is very unlikely that we will see business as usual. It's also worth adding here, I guess, another risk that I haven't listed in the side here, that any legislation that the House chose to pursue under these circumstances would also be in limbo. That is, that if we started to pursue a budget, if we started to pursue any other kinds of laws or amendments to laws, at the point that the courts were to say this election was not legitimate, all of that would probably fall apart. I want people to kind of think about the US election we just saw and all of the claims of fraud and illegitimacy that came with it. I don't mean to do the same thing with Newfoundland and Labrador, but I think it's important to recognize that unlike the US election, we do actually have a number of significant irregularities here. And these cause confusion surrounding the election and whether or not it's legitimate. And so we need to keep that in mind. These risks that we're talking about are very significant, and we need to be aware of them regardless of who claims victory. So keep in mind that a majority of votes have not yet been cast. We don't know who the party leader with the most seats will be or who can command the confidence of the legislature. We shouldn't assume that we know that when there's a number of possibilities. And quite frankly, I would say at the end of the day, if the courts do invalidate elections and this was the avenue we took, this is the worst possible scenario of all of the possible scenarios. And it is a good deal worse than any other scenario that we might find ourselves in. Again, with regard to invalidation, it could be a drawn-out legal process. It may be something that we don't know about for a long time. Now, secondarily, we could kind of think of the election as uncertain, and we could say that instead, we treat it as uncertain. In other words, the Premier and Cabinet maintain caretaker roles. The legislature could sit temporarily, but without sort of exercising full executive authority and kind of attempting to make big changes or implement platforms. If this were to happen, we can kind of think of two scenarios too. We could think of waiting for the courts, which would give us an unclear time period, or we could think of trying to move to a new election relatively soon. There are risks involved here, but I would say they're significantly smaller than they are with the previous avenue. That is that there are potential problems with the ability to spend, but to the extent that I understand using special warrants, it sounds like this is not that significant. It means we would have an extended period of limited government, but again, if we were doing this because we were uncertain of election results, that's probably the more prudent risk to take. And then I guess there's also the cost and fatigue of potentially going to another election should we choose to follow that route. And I understand that being problematic, but I would also say this exists no matter which avenue we choose. The likelihood of another election is probably not insignificant in any of these scenarios. It's possible that we'll simply have to sort of accept that the election is uncertain, potentially illegitimate, and that moving to a new election is actually the best way to sort of get back to usual, or the shortest route to normal, if you will. That this will allow us to ensure that we have a legitimate election and that we do it and move on with a proper government past that time. Waiting on the courts, of course, like I said, it would have an unclear time frame. For the House of Assembly to actually sit, it would need to elect a speaker, which it could still do under the circumstances. And I would also just note that holding two elections in a short time frame isn't unheard of in Newfoundland and Labrador, sorry. 1972 would be the most recent example of this, and so it has occurred before. Were it to happen in this case, I think we need to think about the fact that a new election isn't necessarily a bad thing. Calling an election is essentially the most important thing that a lieutenant governor can do. It's one of the powers that I think is probably the most significant, and holding elections is probably the factor that most literally makes Canada and makes Newfoundland and Labrador democracies. So I just want to kind of say now, what would I recommend under these circumstances? And I realize these may not be what everybody would recommend. I want to think of these as opportunities to discuss what we could be doing. And also to recognize that these would require some degree of party agreement before election results are known. So first of all, I would say that recommendation one would be that following the election results, we do not change who the Premier is, regardless of the outcome of the election, that we maintain caretaker status. And we don't take the results of the election as indicating who exactly should be Premier at this exact time. I'd say that step number two should be to amend the Elections Act with multi-party support. So have a temporary sitting of the House of Assembly, elect a speaker, and ensure that any future election is able to proceed as required and that we don't end up in this situation again. The legislature will need to make this priority number one, but I would say that under any circumstance going forward, this has to be what we do next. There are a range of needed amendments. I won't get into those here, but this has to be top priority. I'd say that next what we should do is essentially allow 1 month in caretaker status. Again, the Premier can remain the Premier. Caretaker status is maintained, so government is not doing significant things aside from perhaps overseeing amendments to the Election Act in the House of Assembly. And this will allow for legal evaluation. It will also allow for the Chief Electoral Officer to report on election adjustments and irregularities that were under his purview. I also think it'd be worthwhile to consider an independent advisory panel with significant legal expertise reporting to the legislature. And this would mean that we could have sort of outside eyes looking right now, trying to advise on whether or not this election is likely to be viewed as legitimate by the courts or not. And from that point, I think after that 1 month period, we could consider a move to a new election if necessary. We could consider maintaining caretaker status, but this would also give us the breathing room to just kind of lay low, take it easy after this election, and not try to jump out front, try to say who won or who lost or who should get to do what. And this will give us, of course, some time frame to kind of clarify if it's likely that this election now will be viewed as legitimate by the courts, then we can accept the legislature and perhaps move on with it. As has been noted by constitutional expert Lyle Skinner recently, it would be best if the Chief Electoral Officer could publicize the legal basis for adjustments as they're made, but in any case, he will be required to report this within 30 days after the election. So we will get that information by that time regardless. I also want to clarify then that the circumstances in Newfoundland and Labrador are not currently what we would typically consider a constitutional crisis. But a constitutional crisis does remain possible, and it should be avoided at all costs. If we get to a circumstance where there is an attempt for a different premier, where there is a move to show confidence in the legislature without having amended the Elections Act, then that could be a significant mistake, and that could actually move us towards either requiring an election when we're not ready for one, or into some other form of crisis, which we could actually consider a constitutional crisis. I just want to wrap all this up by saying Newfoundland and Labrador, we can do this. It will take some agreement by parties, and it will take agreement by them before the election results are known, before they begin jockeying for their own interpretation of those results. Right now, this needs to be less about who wins and who loses. It can be that again soon, but right now, parties and citizens need to see beyond questions of who will be premier and focus on questions of how we can ensure that we are effectively democratic. I'll just wrap up by saying I've left a couple of readings there. I do actually talk a little bit of information that's available in a book that I helped co-author with Chris Cochran and Rand Dick. But more so, again, this is not a research paper. This was an opportunity to talk about some things and hopefully facilitate some discussion going forward. All the best to everyone.